We now turn to the 15th module of the UGC program in Applied Linguistics, which is one of the courses in the whole linguistics program. And this 15th module is concerned primarily with the direct method. But I'll also briefly introduce you to several other methods in this module, as you will see in your actual written module. But the focus is on the direct method. The direct method was, as you might imagine, a very powerful, immediate, natural reaction to the grammar translation method, the GTM, known as GTM, and direct method is called DM. So DM was a natural reaction to GTM. The most severe limitation of the grammar translation method was that it ignored the spoken skills completely, and that it ignored the communicative encounters that people may run into. So people could be very efficient in reading and translating Greek or Latin or Sanskrit, but they could not conduct a small conversation in Greek, Latin, or Sanskrit. So that was the problem. As you might have seen, even in the case of English, you may come across many people who are very proficient in reading and writing. That's what at one time English was called the library language of India, because you learnt it to pass exams, to get a job, to do your work, and you wrote it, you wrote the language and you read the language, but you never used it at home. You never used that language among your friends. So your spoken and listening skills and your, let's say, listening comprehension and productive spoken abilities were highly limited. You could not sustain a conversation in English. So that was a major limitation of the grammar translation method. And the direct method said no, the grammar translation method has been ignoring it, and listening and speaking are very primary. So we will go into the opposite direction, and they said we will not use the source language at all. So you see, grammar translation method was squarely located 100% in the language of the child, whereas the direct method said no source language. So in fact, as you might have heard, in many of the public schools and the convents of even semi-urban rural areas, what to talk of metropolitan cities like Delhi, Bombay, or Calcutta, if you spoke a word of your own language in the school, you were punished or you were fined, and those were the consequences of direct method. The claims made by, for example, experts from the British Council, or claims made by the great English teachers was, look, for God's sake, you are getting only 40 minutes of teaching English, and in those 40 minutes, give the child as much spoken English as possible, and then don't allow the child to use any other language in the class. Now, this, all of us today are convinced that this was a very, in some sense, a subhuman approach to treat languages of children and to language teaching. But the popularity of the direct method was not just because there had to be a reaction to grammar translation method. There were several other things happening. For example, the enormous amount of work done in the field of phonetics. We now had a much better understanding of the spoken skills of the spoken language in terms of phonetics, which is the science of speech. in the work of people like Henry Sweet or Daniel Jones or Palmer. All these people were working very intensively. Even today, if you want a guide to English pronunciation, then you refer to the pronouncing dictionary of Daniel Jones. Uh, these people undertook a systematic study of sound, so it became possible now to provide models. You see, earlier it was not possible to provide a native speaker in the grammar translation class everywhere. But now, with the invention of the phonogram, and later on with the invention of the tape recorder, and with the invention of the magnetic tape, where the where you could multiply tape recorders infinitely with magnetic tape. You could bring the native speaker into the classroom. So the emphasis on the spoken skill was was there because of these reasons also. Then the next important factor in the sort of more or less, you know, amazing, striking growth and acceptance of the direct method was that it was argued that if you have to learn the target language, you must learn to speak like a native speaker. So there's something called the native model, without realizing that all native speakers do not speak the same way. You see, I have already illustrated to you in several other modules that there are hundreds and hundreds of varieties of English. Within the small island of England itself, forget about Australia and Canada and the huge North America, and various other places like New Zealand where English is spoken. I mean, there are hundreds of varieties of English within a small island of England. There are many, many varieties. So which native variety? Of course, the simple answer was that you speak the standard variety, the so-called RP, the received pronunciation, which in England itself is spoken in 10 kilometers area in the south of England. How could that speech be extended to millions of people in India when it could not be extended to England itself? Right? But then, that was the foundation of the direct method, that we must learn how to speak like a native speaker. And this is the way native languages are acquired, by exposure to native speech and to native speakers, and therefore this is a natural way. We should continue with that. How was it implemented? What was done in the classroom? So there was lots of it's on your screen. You can see the slide on your screen. The implementation part included that there was lots of oral interaction, spontaneous use of the language, no translation between first and second language, and no analysis of grammatical rules. You see, in the grammar translation method, there was an explicit analysis of grammatical rules. There were illustrations, there were examples, and a rule was formulated, and then it was explicitly taught. Grammar translation method was not helpful in preparing for teaching communication. Direct method was. So that's how it was. And all grammar was to be inferred, and therefore it ended up being learner-centered. Lessons were embedded in a context, and it was focused on speech and not on the textbook. And every teacher was supposed to prepare her own materials based on some kind of guidelines in the textbook, and not use the source language of the children at all. In fact, the preference was that a native speaker should come and teach, and that listening and speaking must come before reading and writing. The fundamental principles that were followed in the grammar translation method, they are on the screen, they are on your slide, and I am going to run through them. Please keep looking at the slide. They were, the The principles were totally unlike the principles of grammar translation method, and their classroom instruction was conducted exclusively in the target language. The context of teaching was the focus in this method. Oral communication skills were built up in a carefully graded expression. So class size was important. If you have direct method, then the class size is very important, because you can't have native speaker communication encounters with, let's say, 80 children. So this was a major limitation of, and Indian classrooms tend to be very big. So one has to keep in mind that you should have only 25, 30 students in the case of the direct method. Rules of grammar, sentence construction, and agreement in particular were taught inductively. Comprehension is a significant part of this approach, but first on listening comprehension. And just as grammatical accuracy was insisted upon in grammar translation method, accuracy in pronunciation and in well-formed grammatical sentences was emphasized in the case of the direct method. What were some of the main limitations, as you must have guessed by now? What were the main limitations of the grammar translation of the direct method? The major limitation was that it depended. If you really wanted a native-like speech, you wanted a native teacher, and there weren't enough native teachers. There weren't enough Englishmen teaching English language all over India or all over Asia or all over the world. So there was a great shortage. There was also, as Roger Brown noticed in the case of a Japanese teacher, that trying to imitate the direct method, looked more like, or implement the direct method looked the kind of gymnastics, because there are certain sounds that don't exist in Japanese, or certain sounds that don't exist in, let's say, Hindi, but they are the native-like sounds in British English or American English. So what do you do? Consider, for example, the case of what are called interdental fricatives. Sounds as in thin. Now, all of us say thin. If you try to say thin, your tongue will be behind your teeth, but not in the case of British English or American English. The tongue will be between the teeth, and there will be some amount of friction. So you say thin, 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 and you say they, they. Now we say they, but those people would say they. You can see my tongue coming out and sort of vibrating a bit against my teeth, and these are called interdental fricatives. Now, how do you get so many people using interdental fricatives in a country like India? There aren't. And even outside, suppose you train a teacher for 2 sentences or 3 sentences, she would say thin, they, but next time she would say thick, this. It's going to change. Even if she's trained to pronounce this, how are children going to retain it with so many other people saying they and there and thick and thin, rather than thick and thin and they and there? It's not going to happen. So there was a kind of gymnastics that that was noted in the classroom, which was of no use. And the focus was far too much on form. There was, the message or the meaning was not important, and reading comprehension tended to be ignored largely. Coming, as I said, to certain other methods, a very popular method following directly from the direct method was audiolingualism, and it was developed in an attempt to address some of the more commonly agreed upon weaknesses of the direct method. Okay, so there were more oral inputs of all kinds. There was also a focus on the reading and writing aspects. So it was I mean, a more sort of audiolingual approach was more comprehensive, far more comprehensive than the direct method. Another method is called situational approach, which again focused on the oral communication, but it started with a situation, that you first create a situation and then let a dialogue take place in that situation and language will get learned. Uh, there is also a popular method, which was very popular till few years, and we will talk more about it later, called the natural method, developed largely by people like Krashen and Taro, and they insisted that language learning will take place as it does take place in first language acquisition, that you have lot of comprehensible, interesting, challenging input around the child, and no teaching of rules except that monitor, as we discussed in one of the earlier modules, monitor will get naturally activated, and the monitor will once in a while edit the text from a grammatical point of view or a spelling point of view or the expression point of view to improve it. Otherwise, the essential thing that is needed is what is known as comprehensible input in anxiety-free situations. So please try to understand. Comprehensible input in anxiety-free situations where the affective filter is low. Affective filter low, I explained earlier that your attitude is not negative, your motivation is not negative, and sort of your brain filters are like this. So lot of input can become intake. It can go into your head and get processed. Otherwise, if your attitude is negative, if there is a wall here, then the input will go like this. It will not go into your head. This is sort of common sense. And they also emphasize that language is far more important than just the form. And the form is not important. The meaning is important. The message is important, and it's being comprehensible. That is important. Affective filter should be low. That is important. And the anxiety level there should not be, anxiety of exams, anxiety of getting marks, anxiety of doing very well. So if there are anxiety-free situations, that is how you learn your first language. There is no anxiety. There's a lot of things around you which are input, and a lot of it becomes intake when your filter is low. When interesting things are happening, and attention is being paid to you, and your parents are kind to you. In that kind of affectionate atmosphere where there is no anxiety, language learning will automatically take place. Another important method, which is sort of associated with the Coleman report, because Coleman in 1929 was asked to examine whether children were learning foreign languages at all or not. So on modern foreign language study, that is what his report was called, modern foreign language study, and he figured out that even after studying for 2-3 years, children did not learn a foreign language at all. And he said, look, it is because the reading is ignored. The reading in the target language is ignored, and therefore he put forward the reading method. One of the consequences of that was Michael West's 1953 famous general service list of English words, which proved the foundation for many graded readers later on. That you have a list of words which is basic, and you grade them. Michael West had already graded them. This is the first set, the second set, graded the first 100 words, second 100 words, and that is how readers should be created. And that is how reading method became popular. And there are other methods that we will talk about later as we go on, but I have introduced you to some of the main methods of language teaching. We can briefly talk about what is known as TPR. TPR stands for total physical response, which means that people figured out that in the initial stages of language teaching, a total physical response was good. So something like this: you say stand up, so I stand up, and you say sit down, so you sit down. Okay, and then you say, oh, where is your pen? Pen. The other person says pen, and then you say blue pen, the blue pen. So then you say give me the blue pen. Then you get up and give the blue pen. Okay. So there is a total body involved in the transaction of language. And in the early stages of language teaching, people sort of figured out that it was to a great extent successful. So we have covered a whole range of different kinds of methods of language teaching, and the grammar translation method, in spite of all these methods, still maintains a certain role in language teaching in general, particularly in second language teaching and foreign language teaching. But we have learned a great deal from the direct method, from the audiolingual approach, and from the reading method and various other methods. There are small bits coming in. I think it's on the basis of all these that we can talk about a post method era. Thank you.